Hello, and welcome to First Service Residential's webinar, Find Your Way, Building a Better Budget. Just a reminder that everyone will get both a recording of the webinar and a copy of the deck afterward. I'm your moderator, Annette Gallagher, and I'm joined today by two of our experts in operations and budgeting. Barbara Holland, Certified Property Manager, joined First Service Residential in Las Vegas as Regional Manager in July 2015 after serving as President and co-owner of H&L Realty and Management since 1984. Holland is a real estate author and educator and a licensed supervisory community association manager with more than 30 years experience in the field. It's not advancing.
Thank you.
Oh, there we go. Sorry, it wasn't advancing for some reason. Technical difficulty. First Service Regional Director Timothy Snowden joined the Philadelphia High Rise team in 2012. Possessing 19 years' experience in property management, Tim is an accredited residential manager with the Institute of Real Estate Management and a certified manager of community associations, association management specialist, and professional community association manager with the Community Association Institute. He's also a member of the national faculty of the Community Association Institute, where he teaches classes for managers seeking professional accreditation. Just a reminder that everyone is muted. We will have time for questions and answers at the end, and you can ask any questions you like anytime by typing in the panel on the side of the presentation. Today's topics include planning, the secret to healthy budgeting, avoiding costly mistakes, reducing costs and generating revenue, and the right way to raise dues. And now I'm going to turn it over to Barbara Holland to get us started. Go ahead, Barbara.
Well, thank you all very much. If we could take a look at the next screen. So to me, starting a clear vision means that you all, as board of directors, understand the big picture. The big picture as far as your partnership with management as well as the homeowners. And it really starts with, do you really understand or know your community? Because when we're doing a budget, the physical amenities, we're all aging. Being able to do a detailed walk with either your manager or your maintenance technician to see exactly what's aging, as well as modernization. I have a community with a gigantic lake. It's over 35 years old, and it looks like we're going to have to spend $100,000 to replace an aging system with more modern technology. And that's an example of something that maybe the average homeowner doesn't think about. The other thing is, looking at your reserves. Now, my reserves, if you were to look at the lake, doesn't talk about a modernization. It talks about replacing an aeration system. And there's a big difference between spending $100,000 versus $20,000, $30,000. But also, this begins, to me, planning really begins day one, your very, very first board meeting. Do you really understand how to read the financials? Should there be a workshop of some sort to go over the financials so that when you have your monthly meetings, you're identifying things throughout the entire year of operating costs that either you have under budget or you have over budget those numbers, so that information is being communicated to those homeowners who are attending the meetings, as well as what you may produce as far as a newsletter or something on your website, which could include the financial report with notes, so that you have informed not only each other, but you continue to inform your homeowners. You need to also understand the personalities of your board of directors. You may have some directors that when they ran on their platform, no new assessments, no new increases. Well, nobody likes to pay higher bills, but we certainly want the services. So I think it's important for you all as board of directors, to have a strategic planning, to have goals and objectives. Where do you want to take this community? How do we want to improve the amenities? How do we want to improve the services? And I think the other thing in planning is a good understanding of the mood of your homeowners. If you've been increasing dues every single year, you better be able to discuss with them why another increase is necessary in order for them to buy into an increase. We could
so Barbara,
move
what
to
we
that
can we attribute all of that to being aligned in vision? Would that be a good way to sum that up?
I think so, because if you can't get the full board to buy into what you're doing, or at least the majority, because, if you're going to do an increase, especially if it's substantial, you need the board to be part of that platform. What you don't want to have is, here's this major increase as an example, and half the board or the minority group of board of directors do not want to have that increase. And so when an individual homeowner speaks with them, what do you think they're going to say?
Of course.
And then, that doesn't help. In comparing the current spending to budget amounts, this is the variances. Now, often the treasurer or a finance committee may have a lot more detail. They may be getting fuller reports than the average board of directors. Maybe your board of directors are getting a summary as opposed to the treasurer or a finance committee. But between the finance, the treasurer, and the manager, you need to be able to explain to the full board and the homeowners that are there what is the variances, why the variances between the budgeted amount. And you don't necessarily have to wait to the end of the year to make changes. If you see that there's a trend line of, as an example, there's a trend line of my irrigation system. A lot of our communities here, the irrigation system needs to be replaced. And what happens is that every single month we see increases of what I call the Band-Aid approach of fixing it. And the board knows, many of the board directors that are serving more than one term or a series of years, that every single year we go over the repairs to the irrigation system. Now, part of that system happens to be in our reserve, but the main point is that our trend line is telling us how many times are you going to repair the same sections over and over again. And so what may happen is that you may end up accelerating a reserve expenditure. And so I think that's really important that you ask the questions that need to be asked. And even if it means a workshop that could include just the board or the homeowners to go over the variances and to see whether or not during the course of the year, do I need to make a change? If you would kindly, all right. So the historic data, and this is something that in relation to what I had just finished talking about of the trend lines. I used to manage apartment communities, and in those communities, we were responsible for the hot water heaters. And then we started seeing hot water heaters that had to be replaced. And, first it was maybe 1 or 2, and then geometrically it's like 3, 4, 12. And so when we see these different trends, number one, that requires us to make changes. The other thing, what happens when you take over an association mid-year? This is, let's say, it's a brand new association, a brand new board of directors, and we had one that was 4,000 homes. We took over in July of 2018, and we had to prepare a budget. We had to prepare a budget very quickly. And going with our board members and talking to them about the amenities, trying to talk to them about what their goals were and a mission statement and objectives. And then we were looking at other people's historical data. And it was more than just the numbers. You can't just look at the numbers. They give you a spreadsheet. Here's January through September. And so we asked for very specifics, to review not only their detailed ledgers with our finance committee, but to understand. And a perfect example is that their previous management, any of the reserve expenses were actually showing up in the operating. So because of, and hopefully your manager, has a lot of experience with the budgets, we could look at certain line items and say, that doesn't make any sense. That's way too high. And then when we actually looked at the historic data, we saw from the detailed ledgers that they were including reserve items, in their operations. So, reviewing the historic data can absolutely, help you in terms of understanding a community, especially one that's a brand new association, as far as your management.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Barbara. And now we are going to move on to Tim discussing how to avoid costly mistakes.
Well, thank you. Well, I'm Tim Snowden, and we're going to start off with my favorite part of all budgeting. We're going to talk about our reserve funds, or in other words, don't overlook or underfund your reserves. The most important thing that any board can know is what are their future needs. And to understand the future needs of the association, we need to conduct a reserve study. And a reserve study is a 20-year plan that basically tells us all the major components or repairs that we're going to have to make to maintain those major components. And it's important that every board understands that the reserve studies are not a rainy day fund. They're specifically reserved for the replacements of specific existing components, and that's the key word. So when we're planning our reserve budget, we're looking at what are we going to do in the next year, the next 2 years, the next 3 years, the next 4 years, the next 5 years to replace the existing components we have right now. And reserve funding is oftentimes the biggest impact on our budget. Most associations, we'll see a reserve funding might even be 20, 30% of their budget, particularly smaller associations might even get larger. And what we want to do is make sure we don't shortchange the reserves. A lot of boards decide to lower their reserve funding in order to balance their budget, right? So if you have a budget of $1 million, for example, 3% of $1 million is $30,000. And if they decide, well, you know what, that's $30,000 extra if we take $30,000 and don't contribute that to the reserves. And so that's one of the biggest mistakes boards can make. And when you're doing your reserve funding, you have to understand, 3 basic ideas for reserve funding. You have fully funded, threshold funding, and baseline funding. And baseline funding is what you want to avoid. Baseline funding is every year you're asking homeowners for the amount of money needed for those replacements each year. So if you have $100,000 worth of reserves, you're essentially asking the homeowners for $100,000, right? For $100,000 worth of replacements. Like say that's the year you put the new roof on. The new roof's $100,000. You're going up to them and saying, give us $100,000. And that's what you want to avoid, because then you're not planning for future needs. But if you're fully funding your reserves, which is saving for each component each year, you're not going to ask for that money each year. And one statistic that I have here, 72% of associations fail to maintain adequate reserves. So that might be the most important thing you need to do. And you really want to work with a good reserve study provider to do that future planning. And as you see our next bullet that just showed up here, don't simply add X percent to the current budget. When we're looking at what our fees are going to look like next year, many boards just try to predict what the CPI is going to look like, right? They might say, okay, 2%, 3%. We're just going to adjust to the CPI when we raise our fees. Well, that might not always be accurate. In fact, you never know. You might actually find out that you don't need a 2 or 3%. So what you really need to do is go over every line item in your budget separately. So for example, you might have an elevator maintenance contract, and that might increase 5% every year. and that seems to be pretty standard in the industries these days. Well, your insurance line item might increase 10%, right? So now you're looking at, well, that's a lot more than 3%. But you might have other costs. For example, your administrative costs, right? Mailing, postage, things like that. That might not even increase 1%. That might be 0.0001%. So that's why you want to make sure you go through every line item and really take a good look at it and figure out, what's it going to cost me this year? Because then you can figure out, what your total fees will look like in the next year versus just picking an arbitrary number and saying, oh, let's stay within that number. Because as I said, you might actually find out you don't need to raise your fees as much as you thought you did. Now we can go to our next bullet here. So this is a big one. Don't get blindsided by variable expenses, right? I think oftentimes boards might feel that they get a bit optimistic, planning for the future, and they don't look at real costs, or the reverse. They pad their budget too much for variable expenses. So what are variable expenses, you might be saying to yourself? Well, first of all, there are repairs, right? The elevator breaks down. We spend $5,000 on repairs to fix our elevator. That probably was not something we planned on. That's a variable expense. Utilities, of course, are probably the largest variable expense. We often can't control how cold or how hot it gets outside. We wish we could, but oftentimes, that's up to Mother Nature. So when we have those particularly cold winters or those particularly hot summers, we're using a lot more energy. And then sometimes it's payroll. For those associations that have payroll, payroll can be a variable expense depending on the amount of overtime that we have in a year. And overtime can be generated from, legitimate reasons. You might be short on staff. So now you're asking staff members to work 60 hours a week instead of 40 hours a week. Or there could be a real need to add more people. I don't know any association that doesn't feel like they need more people working there. So, but sometimes there are legitimate needs. We find out we need to add somebody else to the payroll. And so that's one of those things that we often have to be prepared for some variation. When you're budgeting, though, you don't want to get too granular with variable costs. You don't want to say, well, let's up all our repairs 20%. Let's up all of our utilities 20%. And payroll, heck, we're going to do 40%. You don't want to do that line item by line item. What works better is you come up with a contingency over all your expenses. And we've seen that works really well is take all your variable costs, predict what they look like, for the last 3 years. What was the average on the last 3 years? And then add 10% on top of that. That's probably a good formula to figure out your variable costs, unless, of course, you know exactly what they're going to look like, but that seldom happens. So always plan for those future contingencies. And if we go to bullet point number 4, we're going to talk about the fact that, we will see increases, right? And actual market prices change. So we definitely don't want to overlook these changes or these market prices. And First Service Residential, we have a very robust network that can help you find the most accurate pricing every year when we develop our budgets. We reach out to vendors, utility companies, other professionals, engineers, and general contractors, landscapers, are very good at helping us predict what those costs are going to look like. Your insurance provider. I mean, when you're developing a budget, most people will be pretty honest. Just call up your insurance provider. Ask, what do you think our increase is going to look like? So we want to be able to find those actual prices by doing our research. We may also want to reevaluate all our contracts. Let's make sure that our contracts, we're getting what we want. Are we being overserved? Seldom, in my experience, you can call up a vendor and say, hey, just lower me. But you can usually work with them because maybe we are being overserved. Maybe we can find a few more dollars off of the contract if we change the scope of service. And occasionally we do. We do find that contractor that we can ask them to sharpen their pencil a bit because we feel, we feel that we're of value to them, but we need some help, and they're usually willing to listen as well. One other trick that I think we found is very successful with a lot of our buildings is, in order to avoid variable costs or cost increase, is to get involved with fixed maintenance contracts. You can get a fixed maintenance contract for just about any component of your building, right? Generally, we do maintenance contracts for things like roofs, right? We have our roofs inspected annually. We have our fire pumps also. serviced annually. Gates, we have those serviced annually, because what that's going to do is that's going to avoid the breakdowns that we have. And the breakdowns are where we really find, our costs continue to increase. One of my favorite things to do when it comes to maintenance contract is doors, right? Some buildings, some high-rise buildings, have like 120 doors, right? 120 doors that have to close because they're fire-rated doors for our safety. But the doors often, come off the hinges and have to be rehung, realigned. The closures need to be adjusted. And a service call just to fix one door can easily set you back, 100, 120 bucks, depending on where you are. So what I like to do is I like to get an annual maintenance contract to have all my doors adjusted, serviced, rehung, and you'll find you can save a lot of money doing that by doing these type of service contracts. And you can be very, very creative when looking for those types of service contracts. Most vendors will give you some type of maintenance contract. You'd be surprised. And they're usually always in a really good mood because they love to hear maintenance contracts. Just like us, right? We don't want those calls at 2 o'clock in the morning. They don't want those calls at 2 o'clock in the morning. They would rather have a maintenance contract to take care of your equipment and your building so they're not getting those 2 o'clock calls. Now we're going to move on to how do we cut costs? And cutting costs can be very creative, but we have to, use our sensibilities, right? When we start cutting costs, we have to do things that make sense. So the first thing we need to do is perform a cost-benefit analysis, right? And one of my favorites, cost-benefit analysis is landscaping, right? Because everybody loves those beautiful annuals that come in with all their pretty colors, and we replant them 4 times a year, and they just look great. But maybe we can get the same benefit from planting perennials, right? Perennials are plants we plant to come back every year, and there's some lovely perennials, so that definitely keeps our costs down. Now, do we get the benefit of the annuals? No, but we need to look. Is it worth it? Is it worth it to change our landscaping from annuals to perennials if we can save costs? And of course, we have to balance unit owners' expectations, because I do know a few unit owners that if they don't see their tulips in the spring, they're going to be pretty upset. So that's always something we're working with too. Another area where we can cut costs is get an energy audit. We're getting a lot better today. I think most buildings are pretty efficient the way we think, the way we work now. But I'm sure we can find savings on every building. There's molders that come to mind that often are using more energy than they need to use. One I find that's still in a lot of buildings are variable speed pumps. If you have a you should install variable speed pumps in your building for your water pump, for your house water pressure. A lot of our buildings, our older buildings, still have pumps that run 24/7, and you're wasting a lot of energy. Where a variable speed pump will come in, it only comes online when there's a demand for water, and you'd be amazed. You'd be amazed the savings. Even a 60-unit building can save like $10,000 a year by installing variable speed pumps. So that's one of those things that we can look for in an energy audit. We also can take the opportunity to renegotiate our contracts, right? And I hit on that before when we're looking for cost savings. And another one is take advantage of bulk buying power, right? Oftentimes, we can partner up with other associations. First Service Residential, we can do some bulk buying, but we can even do some bulk buying on our own. Like winter's coming up for many of us. I know some of us on this call are in more sunny climates, but winter's coming up. And, now's the time to buy calcium chloride. And if we can store, 100 pounds of calcium chloride on site, we can get a lot better price than if we're only storing 10 pounds of calcium chloride. So those are the kind of things we want to look for. Do we have room to store and buy in bulk? It's a great way to save costs rather than running to Home Depot every time we need some more calcium chloride. I also like to talk about one thing that we did at a historical building here in Philadelphia. Is we were able to replace all the wood in the historical building with a composite wood substance known as Trex. If you're familiar with Trex, it's a combination of wood and plastic. But we were able to cut our operating costs significantly because wood, right, needs to be repainted, particularly wood decks, on a regular basis, every 2 to 3 years, depending on the use. And even wood decks that are non-painted need to be weather sealed every couple of years. So you could save a lot of money by using products like Trex Truck says like a 20-year life, right? So for 20 years, you're not doing any more maintenance on your wood decks. And looking for things like that can definitely help you save some costs in your budget. Let's go to the next slide. The next slide is one that I always find really interesting, and this is looking for creative revenue sources, because I can almost guess that there's in a lot of larger buildings that there's areas that we could use for revenue. The simplest ones that come to mind is, do we have community space? Do we have a hospitality room or a community room or a party room? Can we be renting that room out for revenue when it's not being used by the association for official association events? That's actually a really good source of revenue. And then there's other unused space we may have in the building as well. Perhaps we have empty rooms that we can turn into storage spaces, and we can lease those to our residents. We need to make sure that when we do leasing of common space, though, I found that we want to do short-term leases. I learned the hard way. You never want to lease common space, forever. You want to make sure that you have a lease that makes sense. So if the association wants to convert that back into common area someday, that they are able to do so. So I generally like an annual licensing fee whenever you're leasing space to unit owners that's common space. You might be able to find some space that you can lease to retailers or businesses in the area, depending on how your association is set up. Another thing you can look at also is air rights, right? Every building has some air rights, and we can enter into leases for cellular towers. So a lot of times they'll set up a cellular tower and they'll pay us monthly, and that's a source of income that we can use as well. We could also look for parking opportunities, right? Could we provide public parking for a fee if we have excess parking? That's a possibility too. Or if the association owns parking spots, as it seems that more and more of them do these days, or say they own a unit, foreclose on a unit, that can be an opportunity to make some money when we sell those off. However, here's where I'm going to give you a big caution, that just remember that all the income we make, other than the collection of our monthly fees or our monthly assessments, that is all taxable, right? Condominium associations, HOAs, co-ops are generally not for profits, right? But that doesn't mean they're tax exempt. Tax exempt are few and far between. They're only for charities, essentially, in which their money that they collect goes back to the community to do good. So your tax rates can be, 30, 35% on any of the income that you generate. And then if you sell a unit or sell a parking space or something like that, you're going to have capital gains tax on top of that as well. So I've seen a lot of boards that were surprised to find out that, hey, we sold a parking spot for, $100,000. Oh, we only got $50,000 in return. So be prepared for that. And also, if you are leasing or allowing people to park in your association, you got to be careful to make sure you're not violating any parking taxes, because most municipalities do have parking taxes. So it's important you consult your auditor, as well as sales taxes. You might have sales taxes that you have to pay as well. I worked with one in Arizona that was selling snacks at the pool, and one day, somebody from the city came in and told us we should have been paying sales taxes for the last 3 years. So we did get hit by some fines and penalties. So before you think of any other ways to generate revenue, make sure that you look at the tax implications, particularly sales tax if it's something that they're walking away with. And another thing too is just be careful too. What I've seen is associations make mistakes like we're going to charge everybody $1,000 a year just to have a dog. That's something you got to be really careful about, because you're actually creating different classes of ownership, and it's more of a penalty. So that's where you want to go ahead and make sure your attorney feels good about all the ancillary fees that you charge. So that's pretty much what I have. So I want to go ahead and turn it back over to Barbara.
Thank you.
Just before, Tim, if you don't mind, just one quick second. So we could sum up all that wonderful advice you were giving as making sure that board members always check with their association attorney, tax professional or CPA, and governing documents before imposing fees or creating revenue in any way. Is that accurate?
Absolutely.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, Barbara, please go ahead.
Well, here's your slide that says the right way to raise dues. Well, I'll be the first one to admit there's no one right way to tell your residents that it's time to raise dues, but there's a lot of things that you can do. What happens for so many homeowners is that they're surprised. They're surprised because at your board meetings, you've never talked about the fact that your financial reports are showing a negative net cash flow of what's coming in versus what is going out. You have a nice cash balance at the beginning of the year, but what happens every single month, you're taking money out of that cash balance to, be able to pay all your bills. And so this is where that communication starts at the very, very beginning, to let your homeowners know, what's been happening. Sharing the financial statements, whether or not it's on some associations will do it on a magazine or a newsletter on a monthly, quarterly basis to give a snapshot picture of the financial statements on their website, where you can see in more detail the financial statements, and having some sort of narrative that goes with these financial pictures as far as your trend lines, operating expenses, and so forth. I think the other thing is that when you're trying to sell an increase to your homeowners, and we haven't really talked about this, you do need to have a handle on your delinquencies. There's nothing worse that on a type of financial report to tell the homeowners that your delinquency is 30%, as an example. We certainly saw high delinquencies during what I call the Great Recession here in Las Vegas. And this is where the homeowners are going to object. The homeowners are going to say, why are we raising association fees when you have such a large delinquency? And so, in terms of selling and that's basically what you're doing. You're selling the fact that we do need this increase, that you do have a handle on that delinquency. So you could have what I call the State of the Union, whether it be quarterly or semi-annual, in which a special meeting, and this is not necessarily a traditional board meeting, but a special meeting to the homeowners, where you have a chance to hear some of our accomplishments, hear some of our issues, and be able to talk about the finances so that during the course of the year, they're getting prepared that, we may end up having an increase. The mailer that goes out with the budget, just don't give them numbers. You want to prepare and give them an explanation for each line item. And the things that Timothy was talking about, there could be footnotes. Look, we did, when I was back east, I had a number of older buildings that unfortunately was a combination of gas and oil. What did we do to try to make that building more energy efficient other than knocking it down? And that, hey, we ended up insulating the boiler room. That was amazing, just exactly, what happened with the temperature there. But you could sit there and on these line items, we've done a tremendous amount of water conservation here in Nevada. This is what we've done, and to be able to show homeowners we are making an effort to have savings, and here's a perfect example of savings. At the same time, FirstService offers both insurance services where they can, in order to get more competitive insurance bids, and where I know for some of my associations, we were able to get excellent insurance policies and at $4,000, $5,000, less expense. Or the fact of our financial division in terms of income. I just took over a community of 300 and some homes in which just by changing and using our West Coast office here to help us, we were able to increase our interest earned by $21,000 compared to what they were before. So it's these type of explanations that shows not only how you are trying to do money management, how to be more efficient, but to be able to show each line item, what have we accomplished? What have we done in terms of trying to increase the income Some of the comments that Timothy made to try to lessen a burden as far as the fact that we do need to have an increase. As far as implementing small annual increases, you do need to keep up with the cost of living. Right now, in the western part of the United States, it was 2.7%. And that's something that, regardless of whether or not you may not have an increase with the landscape company or the security company or the sweeping company, but obviously, those are things that you're going to find out and talk to them before, you put together a budget. So these small increments, many associations already has built in the CC&Rs that the board of directors can raise the assessments annually by 3% or 4% or 5% without homeowner approval. And that's something that you need to really look at that, so that by taking these small steps, you don't have to worry about later on, hey, we have a $75 increase. To me, some of these small increases are what I call the nuisance increase as opposed to the significant increase. One of the things that Timothy talked about was the reserves. Now, here in Nevada, we're very much mandated in terms of the reserve study. This is not optional. Reserve study has to be done every 5 years. We actually have a 30-year life as opposed to 20-year. We have very specific laws in terms of how to do that funding plan. So that is just something that one of the unusual things in our law, let's assume that we really were underfunded and we really need to make an increase in assessments pertaining just to the funding of the reserve. And let's assume we're lucky if the homeowners reject that. The board of directors actually here in Nevada can overturn that and say, hey, look, per our statute, we're going to have to do this 6% increase in the reserves. And I think one of the things that's really important, one of my association will need to do a major increase on the reserves. And the question that they asked was, how come we weren't properly funded? Well, this goes back to some things that Timothy said. Well, I went back and I looked at their history, and like 15 years ago, you took out a tremendous amount of money towards a capital improvement and never planned how to put that money back in. So when it comes to communicating with your homeowners, to be able to, at the very beginning, keeping them informed of what's happening. I know a lot of boards are afraid to do that because they're afraid of the criticism on social media, which is so easy to see today that someone says, well, you're not taking care of our money carefully. If I was managing it, I'd be able to cut this and cut that, and there's no reason why, we have to have an increase. In fact, it should be a decrease. So telling your story from the day one, and then having some special meetings potentially, or making sure that you have using all the technology as far as the overhead projector, and in some cases even doing a certain amount of show and tell. I know when we did a major irrigation change that was going to save us money in terms of water use as well as in terms of maintenance, we had the landscape company provide different types of photographs that we were able to use on our screens, that the homeowners actually could see it visually as well as to see the financial numbers. So I think the big thing when it comes to raising dues, keep your homeowners informed during the course of the year. Don't be afraid to share that information. Have different types of workshops or presentations during the course of the year. And then when you finally send out that budget information, include a narrative for each line item so they understand exactly where you've been, what you've done, and where you want to go.
Thank you so much for that, Barbara. That was very informative. So now we're going to just move into our takeaways, and I'm just going to run through those quickly. So remember this. It's very important to start with a clear vision and look at both long-term priorities and short-term goals to develop a realistic budget. And that includes making sure that your board is aligned, as Barbara noted earlier. Avoid common mistakes to minimize your risk of going over budget. Reduce your costs sensibly, but as Tim pointed out about underfunding your reserves, don't shortchange your community's future. You can find creative ways to generate revenue to offset some of your additional expenses, but as we mentioned, please be sure to consult with your attorney, tax professionals, and governing documents before you do so. As Barbara noted, it's important to raise dues incrementally to avoid needing a large increase or special assessment all at once. And even more important than that is to communicate those increases transparently all year long to your residents, to emphasize resident benefits, and to use facts and numbers to support the need for any increase that you do implement on your annual budget. And now it is time for questions and answers. And our first question is from Brian, and Brian wants to know, he's got two questions that I'm going to combine. Brian is asking, whose responsibility is it, the management company or the board treasurer, to put together monthly and quarterly financial reports and to put together a budget analysis report to provide to shareholders or residents? So, Tim, Barbara, whichever one of you would like to take that, please.
Well, you have to think about this. I don't know of any communities, or not too many, that actually pay their board of directors. And so you are volunteers. Most of our board of directors are volunteers. And they expect us as professionals to be able to provide information. And as far as, producing the monthly reports, I mean, this is where, we would talk with the treasurer and the board. Is the way that we prepare financials, is this the way that you want to see them? Do we need to make certain changes that makes a difference? I've been lucky that a number of my larger associations come some very specific, some people that have backgrounds, they were financial for their companies over the years, that will actually work with us in designing the budget. So I think a lot has to do, with the expertise of the individual board of directors, but generally speaking, your management company should be providing that information for you.
Thank you so much for that, Barbara. Tim, I'd like you to take the next one if you don't mind, because I know reserves are one of your areas of expertise. And this is from Elizabeth asking, is there a guideline as to what percentage of a community's income should go toward the reserves fund?
Wow. Yeah, that's a question we get all the time. And regrettably, I've got to tell you the truth. It's not like you can take your annual budget, divide it by 23, times it by 52, then the square root of the isosceles triangle, and you come up with that number. There are lending guidelines that lenders like to see, and I even hesitate sometimes to give those out because they change day to day depending on where the lenders are. But generally what we've seen for the last few years is that lenders like to see 10% of your annual fees go into the reserves, as well as 3 months of your annual fees in the bank at any time. And the problem with that, though, is that most associations would be underfunded doing that. Maybe a small HOA would be okay with following those guidelines. So the schoolhouse answer is that you've got to have a reserve study, which we talked about earlier. That reserve study is a funding plan for 20 years. It's going to tell you each year how much money you expect to spend on reserve expenditures. And it's your tool. It's a tool that many lenders want to see. Right now, I know for FHA, Freddie, Fannie, they want to see a reserve study that's less than 3 years old. And once again, I hesitate to be quoted on that because things change. I remember when they weren't as strict. But you really need to have a reserve study. That's the only way you can really tell where your reserve funding should be.
And following up on that, Robert would like to know, how often do your more fiscally responsible associations update those reserve studies? Is there a best practice that you recommend, a time frame for which reserve studies should be updated?
Well, if I could
absolutely.
Jump in.
Sure.
If I could jump in, we're mandated to do it every 5 years. So, and the reason for this is that homeowners have been complaining that, all of a sudden they're being hit with a $2,000 special assessment that needs to be paid up front or quarterly or monthly. And so part of our law here requires, for us to do every 5 years. So we're mandated to do that. The only time that we'll do it sooner is if we have done a tremendous amount of major improvements and expenditures on our reserves that requires us to that we've changed it significantly, that the reserve specialist needs to take a look at it. And if I could just drop one other thing, I don't know whether or not you can do it in your states, but here in Nevada, for many associations and the way their governing documents are written, we actually can require 2 to 3 months of a capital contribution for every new buyer. And so that also helps in terms of that reserve study.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Kim, thank you. I was going to ask you to follow up on that, please, from other areas, geographic areas.
Sure. No, I was going to add to what Barbara said is the common industry standard always has been every 5 years to get your reserve study updated. As I said earlier, the FHA, Freddie, and Fannie now like to see a reserve study that's not less than 3 years. So that's requiring a lot of associations to up their schedule. The good news is, there's 3 types of reserve studies that are recognized. You have what's called a level 1 reserve study, which is the reserve specialist prepares it with no assumptions. They go in and they start from scratch, and those can be very costly. But there's also level 2 reserve studies, which is updated with some investigations, but not as many as you would do on a level 1. And then there's a level 3 study, which is essentially the reserve provider never leaves their desk. They take it, they update it for inflation. They'll ask you a few questions about, have you replaced your roof? Have you done that? So if you really just need to hit that 3-year mark, you can do the level 3. If you have a really good level 1 study, all you need to do is do 2s and 3s to update it as time goes on. Like Barbara pointed out, if you have a major event, if you've done a major replacement, and as far as what Barbara mentioned about the capital contribution, yeah, many states have that. I can tell you both Pennsylvania and New Jersey, where I work now, has that. You do need to, it's specific by state, and your state will spell out what those funds can be used for. But if you're not aware of that capital contribution that you can collect on resales, you probably want to talk to your attorney about it and see if you can do that.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Anyone whose questions did not get answered, we will take the time to answer you by email, because we do want to make sure that all of the questions are addressed. And thank you so much to everybody who participated today. This does conclude our webinar. Thank you, Barbara and Tim, for sharing your time and expertise. And thank you to everybody who joined us via web. We will be sending our recording out shortly. For more information about how FirstService Residential can help with your association or building management needs, including planning, budgeting, and reserves, email us at learn@fsresidential.com or visit fsresidential.com. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.